Hello, I'm so pumped to be starting this book. It is Lightland by H.L. McCutcheon. I'm going to zoom in on the cover because you're going to need it in a little bit. But in my opinion, this is the most underrated book of all time. I won't say it's my favorite book because I love Harry Potter, I love The Wizard of Oz, and I love Hatchet. Those are probably my three favorite children young adult books. This book is also one of my favorites, probably number 4. And the thing is, unlike Harry Potter, Wizard of Oz, and Hatchet, it's not really celebrated. Not too many people have ever heard of it. When I read it to a class, most students haven't heard of it. I've actually put this book in several libraries because I have requested it so frequently for my classroom, and different students have requested to read it along with me. I love this book. This book comes to us from Iowa, and we found this book when I was a child because my dad was every single night until I was in middle school. And I really loved that. It was just a great time for us to be together as a family. It really encouraged us all to be better readers. And my dad eventually ran out of books that he wanted to read us. And so he went to the local library and he asked the librarian, and he said, we're out of books. These are the ages of my kids. What do you kind of recommend for a good fantasy fun book? And this is what the librarian recommended. I have since read it 6 or 7 times. It's just a wonderful story, very fantasy-based. So if you like Harry Potter, you like Wizard of Oz, you kind of like that more, or Wings of Fire, that kind of stuff, that more adventurous kind of fantasy book, this is going to be right up your alley. If not, I encourage you to keep an open mind. I just think that this book is so creative in so many different ways. It's unlike any other book that I've ever read. And so I hope you really enjoy it. It is the only book by this author, and it's going to be fantastic. So I know for your questions, you have to look at the cover. So this is what the cover looks like. This is the back. It says, until now, Lottie Cook and her best friend, Louis Weaver, have lived fairly normal lives in Iowa. But when Lottie's father carves for her a magical box from an old cherry tree, she and Louis are transported to Lightland, a fantasy world created by the memories of real-world people. The Wicked Night King rules over Lightland, determined to destroy its citizens by stealing their memories. Lottie and Louis are caught in a terrifying battle between good and evil, during which they must confront some painful memories of their own and find strength to endure the challenge. So this is a wonderful book. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. One thing that I've always liked about this book, just last thing I'm going to say before I, continue raving about this book forever, is that I really like how this book was formatted. I often say that it doesn't matter the font and things like that, but I really love how this book contrasts dark and light. And so every chapter has a dark page like this where the text is all in white, and I'll be sure to show you those. And then the next page is all regular white paper with a black font. And so you see each chapter, I'll try to find another one, kind of shows something like this. So for me, that kind of adds to my enjoyment as I'm reading this book. So let's begin. Prologue. Lottie Cook's mother died the same minute that Lottie was born. Her father said she came into this world with her eyes wide open, and that may be the reason why her earliest memories were amazingly clear. She remembered the cold metal of the hospital crib and the flat, tinny taste of powdered baby formula. She did. She remembered her father's long, lonely hands holding her, carrying her home from the hospital by himself. She remembered his wide, flat smile the first time she ever saw it. Remembering was Lottie's avocation. She had started by collecting stories about her mother that she never knew. Even when she was a tiny child, her father depended on her to gather memories, keep them safe, and share them. When she was 4 years old, she was a miniature storyteller telling tiny miniature stories. As she grew, so did her stories. The first magic thing happened to Lottie when she turned 11 years old. That was the year her greatest adventures began. But to fully understand these things, it's best to go backward a bit, to a rainy summer morning, years earlier, when 6-year-old Lottie was banging on a locked door. The Story Box. Chapter 1. Lottie and her father lived alone in a strange little house in the middle of an Iowa cornfield. This particular stormy morning, 6-year-old Lottie was locked out of her father's building room. It was a week before the first day of first grade. She was peeking through the gaping crack at the bottom of the crooked homemade door when she heard the sound of shuffling feet. She didn't have to look up. She knew that shuffle by heart. "Louis, take a look," Lottie whispered. What's he doing this time? I don't know. All I can see is his feet. 6-year-old Louis Weaver was Lottie's best friend. Lottie was Louis's only friend. No one else knew. He hadn't uttered a word until he was 3 years old. And then when he did, it was exclusively to Lottie. This was the first thing to know about him. The only person in the entire world who he talked to was Lottie. This irritated his mother beyond description. No matter how Mrs. Weaver fussed and fumed, Louis would only nod, shrug, shake his head, and talk to Lottie when no one else could hear. Mrs. Weaver tied a little notebook to Louis every morning with the idea that he would at least communicate by writing and drawing. And every evening she fussed when his notebook was only filled with strange symbols and squiggles that communicated precious little. Grown-ups in town felt certain that this would change in just a few days when Louis was required by law to start first grade and things would be expected of him. Louis tried to pry open the building room door for a peek, but it was bolted tight. He rattled the doorknob. "Keep out!" Lottie's father bellowed through the locked door. "It's not finished. It's a present for your first day of school." Lottie calmly shook her head. "I'm not going to school," she said evenly to Louis. Kindergarten was optional in Oxford, Iowa, and so Lottie and Louis had opted out last year. They were both plenty smart, and the town kindergarten run by Miss Connie in her ranch house behind the post office seemed like a colossal waste of time. Miss Connie taught advanced classes such as sharing, it's not always your turn, and glue, not for eating. Last year, Lottie and Louis, who could read when they were 3 and write when they were 4, had handwritten and illustrated an essay outlining why they didn't need to go to kindergarten. Without consulting their parents, they had submitted the essay directly to Miss Connie. Miss Connie, embarrassed and offended, phoned their parents to say that the kindergarten class was full. The same approach had not worked regarding first grade, but they hadn't given up yet. "I'm not going to school," Lottie repeated to the locked door. "Ever." "Oh, yes, you are," her father barked definitively. "My mother says school is wonderful," Louis said without conviction. Lottie and Louis looked at each other and then burst out laughing. Nearly everything that Mrs. Weaver said made them laugh. She was always wrong. Louis's father had disappeared when Louis was 3. Mr. Weaver had been a brilliant scientist. No one ever spoke about him anymore, and Louis and Lottie had the distinct feeling that everyone was afraid to even mention him. When he vanished, Mrs. Weaver simply acted as though he had never existed. Mrs. Weaver was an unpleasant woman who wore a perpetual pucker, as though she were sucking lemons dry, Lottie said. Her brow was always furrowed, and her fists were always clenched. It was a shame. But at least they had Lottie's father, who loved them both. Eldon Cook was a shadowy man with the longest fingers you ever saw. He was somewhat somber to the rest of the world, but when he looked at Lottie, his smile could light up a room. He loved her plain brown hair. He loved the 7 freckles on the bridge of her nose. He loved the deep well that he fell into when she looked at her hazel eyes. And he loved the way that those eyes seemed to change color with weather. He had one treasure in this world, and it was Lottie. Later that evening, after Louis and Lottie had made their own supper, cornbread, corn mash, and leftover Iowa corn, and after Louis had been dragged home through the rain, Lottie heard the building room lock turn again. At last, Mr. Cook emerged with something under his arm. It was wrapped in an old quilt, but it looked to be almost the size of a shoebox. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he let her unfold the quilt. It was, well, a shoebox. A wooden shoebox with a wooden lid that fit neatly on top. It was cherry wood, and Lottie instantly worried that he had cut down the old cherry tree by the back door. It was polished deep, shiny black cherry color. "You have the best memory of anybody I've ever met, Lottie. You remember big things and little things and things that never even happened. There's a room in that pointy head of yours that soaked up everything that goes around you, but school is coming." Lottie rolled her eyes as if to say, "We'll see about that," while Mr. Cook opened the box. Inside was brighter cherry and almost seemed to glow in the darkening room. "At school," her father continued, "there will be other things to remember, crowding your brain, like 5 plus 8 and how to spell Arkansas." 5 plus 8 equals 13, said Lottie. Mr. Cook laughed and messed up her hair. "Arkansas, Lottie spelled. "I know you already know everything, but you still have to go to school, so," he smiled, pleased with himself, "that's why you'll need this." Lottie just stared. "It's a story box," her father continued. "In this box, you keep little bits and pieces of every story you need to remember. That way, when your head fills with school facts, you won't run out of room and forget the truly important things." He kissed the top of her head and pressed the box into her arms. Yeah, just thinking. Yeah. Lottie held the smooth box, and it felt warm in her hands. "Did you cut down my cherry tree?" "Well, now, Lottie, yes and no." Lottie bit her lip and twisted her hands and walked to the kitchen window. She pushed it open and leaned out to see the storm. There, through the streaming rain, she could see nothing. Where her favorite tree should have been was a bare patch in the yard. It was hit by lightning last night, her father said quietly. The tree wouldn't have survived, but you can have the box to keep forever. Lottie wasn't pleased. She told a story quickly. I remember, she began quietly. I remember that tree before I was born when Mama spit a cherry seed from the kitchen window, and she sang to that tree every morning while she waited for her tea water to boil. And when she was gone and I was a baby, I slept on my back under the cherry flowers, and I could still hear her singing. Her father was smiling quietly at her, waiting. You could have tried to save my tree, she said. I don't think it would have made it, but it might have. How could she accept a gift that had taken her memory tree away? The more she thought about it, the more furious she became with her father. This box is very small, she said. It won't hold much. Thunder rumbled through the cornfields outside. The box seemed to shimmer when the lightning flashed and the thunder boomed closer to home. Mr. Cook's wide, flat smile spread until he was grinning ear to ear. I already thought of that. Just give it a try. But Lottie didn't. A few days later, it was time for school to start. Lottie was in a terrible mood. She hadn't forgiven her father for cutting down her tree, and now he was making her go to school. She snubbed the new yellow checkered dress he had purchased especially for her. At 8 minutes, she still sat at the breakfast table in her blue flannel pajamas and purple slippers. I hope you don't think you're wearing pajamas to school, her father said nervously. This way I can pretend it's all a dream, Lottie mumbled to her cornflakes. Then she looked up and gave her father an icy glare. Besides, if you make me wear anything else, I'll just take it off when I get there. Make me get dressed and I'll go naked instead. You know I would. He knew she would, so Lottie Cook went to school in her pajamas every day. She honestly didn't give a hoot what anyone else thought. Lottie was so put out with her father for making her go to school that she sulked in the better part of 5 years and kept wearing pajamas. She wasn't teased as much as you might have guessed. What was the fun in teasing a person who just didn't care? So Lottie wore pajamas for all of first and then all of second grade. Sure, a few people pointed when she still wore them for third grade, fourth grade. By fifth grade, it was old news. When sixth grade rolled around, Lottie studied the Sears catalog for thicker, fleecier pajama outfits. The problem is walking to school in the winter, she told Lewis. The wind cuts right through the flannel. Lottie and Lewis walked to school together 4 mornings a week. On Fridays, Lewis was driven directly to a speech therapist in Cedar Rapids in hopes that he would learn how to talk to somebody else besides Lottie. What do you do in speech class, Lou? Lottie wanted to know. You don't talk to him, do you? Lewis recoiled at the thought. Of course not. I listen to him enunciate for a while. Then while he talks on and on, I go to sleep, and I sleep all the way through. They laughed. Lewis slept with his eyes wide open. Not catnapping, not daydreaming, full out sleeping. And if you didn't know the secret only Lottie and Mrs. Weaver knew, you would have no idea. While Lewis slept, his thick eyelashes blinked. His dark brown eyes gazed as usual. The only thing different was that his head would tilt slightly downward and his mouth sort of relaxed. He never had dreams, and he couldn't wake up instantly when he needed to. If he responded a little slowly sometimes, people thought it was just because he was, well, a little slow. Lottie had tried to teach Lewis how to sleep with his eyes closed, but it didn't take. Even at night, this is how Lewis slept, when he slept at night. For the most part, however, Lewis slept through the day. He slept through school, and no one noticed. Teachers never called on Lewis since he wouldn't speak anyway. Lottie would poke him whenever it was time for lunch or a fire drill or something. He slept through church, through car rides, bus trips, and piano lessons. The other incredible thing was that Lewis seemed to absorb what was going on around him while he slept. He could still perform on recital day, never missed his bus stop, and his grades, while not spectacular, were officially good enough. At night, he puttered quietly around his house and sometimes slipped into town if there was enough moonlight. Just looking at things, he said. Lewis didn't really like the dark. It made him nervous. But it was when nights were clear and bright he would venture out. Lewis's pale skin had a soft kind of light to it, which Lottie thought had to be from the moon. This was one of the things Lottie liked best about Lewis, this mystery. Was he awake or was he asleep? Lottie and Lewis both turned 11 over the summer. They always had a small party together during August. As usual, the guests included Lewis's mean-spirited cousin, James Ray from Cedar Rapids, and little Cindy Arnold from down the road. Summer birthdays were a bit of a non-event. Most kids their age were at summer camp or on family vacations or too busy working on farms to help celebrate. The few occasions where their parents got together were sources of great amusement for Lewis and Lottie. The two adults were so different that it was funny to watch them sit awkwardly next to each other on the picnic bench trying to pretend that they enjoyed each other's company. Mr. Cook, who was not a timid man, would ask timidly, "Had a nice summer?" "Not especially. Why do you want to know?" Mrs. Weaver would answer suspiciously, and then she'd remember her manners and smile a thin, strained smile. Sometimes when they wanted a good belly laugh, Lewis and Lottie pretended that Mrs. Weaver was going to marry Mr. Cook. And on their wedding day, Lottie would say, opposites around the world would unite in peace, harmony, and love. Good and evil, day and night, Lewis said. Perfect. Whipped cream and tuna fish, said Lonnie. Delicious. For their party, all Lewis and Lottie ever cared about was that Mrs. Weaver baked one of her incredible birthday cakes, which grew by another layer every year. This year was 11 thin, moist layers of devil food cake. Baking cakes was the only thing that Mrs. Weaver did better than just about anybody. But when you said how good the cake was, she'd only scowl and tell you what was wrong with the recipe and say something like, I'll never be foolish enough to bake that again, let me tell you. Cost me a fortune in eggs. There were 22 candles on the massive cake this year. They each insisted on having their own set. It looked like a bonfire. Last year, a mere 20 candles. It had taken them several tries to get the flames out. So to tackle 22, Lewis and Lottie had taken a huge breath and prepared to blow, when from out of nowhere, a narrow gust of wind whistled through the yard and snuffed every single one out. Everyone else thought that Lottie and Lewis had blown them out and clapped. Mrs. Weaver started slicing thick slabs of cake. Did you see that? Lottie whispered to Lewis. Lewis nodded, frowning. It's an omen, Lewis, Lottie said with a grin, biting at her cake. 11 is going to be a very interesting year. Lewis looked doubtful. Really, Lou? School starts in 2 weeks, and they still haven't found anyone to teach in Miss O'Neill's place. Maybe this means they'll skip us ahead to 7th grade. They both knew that was too good to be true. They'd hire someone to teach 6th grade, all right, and at this late date, they might scrounge up somebody truly horrible. Lou was worried about it. Lottie licked the last bit of Crisco frosting off of her plate and chuckled at Lewis's troubled expression. I've got a feeling, she insisted with a chocolatey grin, that gust of wind was a good sign. On September 1st, they chatted as they walked the 20 minutes to school. Lottie felt fantastic in her new aqua blue fleecy polar trek pajama ensemble. Lewis looked stressed. His socks didn't match. His crew neck was inside out. His curly dark hair was more strung out than usual. Even as they disappeared into the cornfield, he kept jerking his head around. He didn't want to be heard talking, but since most of their walk was through fields on the outskirts of town, they almost never saw anyone else. They always took a shortcut through the field. It's tricky finding your way through tall rows of corn. Unless you have exceptional sense of direction and really know what you're doing, you could become completely disoriented and be lost for hours. It's like a thick green corn maze. Of course, Lottie and Lewis had done it all their lives. They loved the quiet rustling of corn. They always sighed when they emerged from the field and had to walk the dusty main road to town. Coming out of the corn that day, Lewis was still fretting out loud nonstop. I'm telling you, Lottie, new teachers make me nervous. She doesn't know us. She'll ask questions. She'll expect me to talk. She'll want you to wear real clothes. It can't be good. Oh, come on, Lou. How do you know? We've never had a new teacher before. That's what I mean. Who is she? Why would she want to live out here in the middle of nowhere at the last minute like this? No one new ever comes here. That's what, she needed a job. She's probably so stupid no other school would hire her. Lewis shook his head. It's suspicious. Everything could change. What if she's not stupid? What if she's smart? This was an excellent question. Lottie and Lewis depended on being significantly more clever than their teachers. I'm telling you, there's something Lewis suddenly stopped talking. Lottie looked over her shoulder to see who was coming. Lewis had stealth radar when it came to talking. If anyone but Lottie came within earshot, he instantly clammed up. Sure enough, Betsy Pelican had come around the post office hedge and was gaining on them. Lewis didn't say another word as the three of them walked to school, and Betsy chattered on about her family's vacation trip to Missouri. Then Betsy tossed her long blonde ponytail and announced that she had met their new teacher on the Main Street feed store over the weekend. Her name was something French. She bought 100 pounds of Harvest Hill Senior dog food, Betsy said knowingly, pleased to be a source of information. Is she nice, Lottie asked. Is she smart? Lewis nodded, wanting to know. She's different, Betsy said. She's hard to describe. As they climbed up the steps to the Oxford United School, the new teacher was waiting for them in room 11. She wasn't exactly old or young, tall or short. She was pretty, but you couldn't quite exactly say why. Her hair was pulled back into a soft bun. She wore small tortoiseshell glasses and had lots of wrinkles around her green eyes, like a person who smiles all the time. But she didn't smile at them as they came into the room. She just watched them, greeting them with her eyes. She was very serious. The 6th graders came in noisily, but then quickly settled down when they saw her. Only when all 12 students had entered, she did smile. Briefly. Then she turned and wrote her name on the chalkboard, Miss d'Avignon. She called the roll and seemed to be sizing up each of them as they answered. When she called Lewis's name, he just raised his eyebrows and looked at her. Lewis Weaver, she asked again. Lewis nodded once. The class tittered. Miss d'Avignon inhaled deeply and looked her students over, head to toe, making notes on the small clipboard. Welcome to 6th grade, she announced finally. My records show that you are 11 or 12 years old. By now, I expect you know just about everything there is to know. The class laughed nervously. Miss d'Avignon didn't. To make sure of it, she continued, I would like each of you to write an essay for me entitled Everything I Know. Most of the sixth graders groaned. Essays, whimpered Gallenwolf. My brother told me sixth grade would be multiple choice. I'll give you a month to work on it because I want to see a lot of effort. Lottie chewed on the end of her new pen and thought about knocking off this essay during her lunch hour. It was such a vague assignment that pretty much anything she wrote should be good enough. She'd draw up a little list of her favorite subjects, mention some books she's read, and wrap it up with a summary of her chores at home. Everything she knew. She yawned. Lewis was wrong to worry. Sixth grade would be no different. Miss D'Avignon called on Janice Forrester, who, as usual, was holding her hand up straight in the air like a flagpole. If you don't tell us how many pages it should be, some of the kids in here won't write more than a paragraph. How many pages should it be, Miss D'Avignon? That depends, Janice. How much do you know? Miss D'Avignon challenged. She looked around the room and Lottie felt certain. She locked eyes with Lottie Cook. Starting at the beginning, begin with your earliest memories. Miss D'Avignon still didn't exactly smile, but Lottie sure did. Earliest memories? Suddenly something happened. A switch had flipped. Lottie was almost glad she was there. She was excited to do her homework. She beamed at Lewis. Lewis blinked back. His head was tilted and his mouth was relaxed. He was asleep. Throughout the day, Miss D'Avignon conferenced with the students one-on-one. She started at the end of the alphabet, first with Ellen Wolf, then Lewis Reaver. When he was called, Lewis was still sleeping, so Lottie shot a spit wad at him while she was pretending to cough. They all believed they could get away with anything in class if they caused a small distraction by pretending they were coughing. Lewis straightened his head and moved forward with remarkable composure. Several classmates chuckled as they anticipated Miss D'Avignon's attempts to converse with Lewis. Is something funny, Miss D'Avignon? Asked the class over her shoulder. They all fidgeted innocently and pretended to cough. The teacher looked back at Lewis, who returned her steady gaze. Lewis Weaver, I've been warned all about you, she said in a low, steady voice. I've suggested that your speech therapy on Fridays be canceled. I think your time can be better put to be used in here. Do you have any problems with that? Lewis shook his head calmly, but his eyes widened. I couldn't care less whether you decide to speak in the sixth grade or not. Your classmates will make more than enough noise to compensate. Frankly, nodding and shaking your head can take you a very long way in life, and I'm sure you've already discovered. Academically, I intend to focus your strengths, which I gather are music, math, and science. Lewis blinked and nodded. Then he actually smiled, something he had never done for a teacher before. Miss D'Avignon smiled back. When Miss D'Avignon called Janice Forrester to her desk at the front of the room, the class almost gasped out loud as they watched her conference take place. Janice's perpetually steely posture sagged, gradually but distinctly, until she was literally slumping in her seat. Even her poker-straight braids seemed to wilt. The class couldn't hear what was said, but from what Janice told Betsy later, it had something to do with the sad consequences of being a tattletale and a know-it-all. Charlotte Cook, Miss D'Avignon called. Lottie didn't care that the class was snickering at her full name while she walked to the teacher's desk. Is something still funny out there? The teacher asked icily. They call me Lottie, Lottie shrugged. My mother's name is Charlotte, said Miss D'Avignon quietly. That's what I'd rather call you. Lottie blinked. Taken off guard, she nodded. Your grades have always been mediocre, Miss D'Avignon said, flipping through her clipboard, except for when they have been superlative. Explain that to me. Lottie spoke before thinking. School's boring usually, she said loudly enough for the rest of the class to hear her and gasp. Miss D'Avignon glared over her shoulder at the coughing class before locking eyes with Lottie again. Not anymore, she said. I expect your essay to be the most insightful in this class. I do not expect that you can finish it during your lunch hour. Lottie's jaw was on the floor. How could the teacher possibly know that she'd been thinking about lunch hour? She didn't know what to say. Miss D'Avignon continued. Sixth grade will be as interesting as you make it, Charlotte Cook. I'm expecting it to be fascinating. Then surprisingly, Miss D'Avignon smiled. Lottie smiled back, and together they laughed. The class muttered and coughed wildly, except for Lewis, of course, who looked relaxed again. As Lottie walked back to her desk, she felt as though her head was filling slowly with helium until she walked on air. She was glad that she went to school. Unbelievable. She was glad to be in sixth grade, and she thought Miss D'Avignon was the most intelligent person she'd ever met. Sixth grade was clearly something at which she would excel. She felt like she was glowing. At supper, her father nearly choked on his corn on the cob when Lottie announced, I loved school today. As Lottie described her day, the meal turned into a feast. Lottie and her father raided the cellar for preserves and syrups. They made cornbread pancakes puffed with real whipped cream and drenched in sticky sweet sauces. Mr. Cook sizzled bacon and squeezed oranges. Lottie boiled pink applesauce, her own secret recipe, and sprinkled it on everything with nastur tums, while she told her father about their new teacher and how the world had changed in an incident. He beamed, he glowed, he hung on to every word that she said. Later, as he tucked her in, Mr. Cook asked Lottie to tell him a story like she used to when she was little. He had so missed her crikey sound of her voice helping him remember things. Lottie squinted her hazel eyes, smiled, and took a deep breath. Thinking of the essay she was going to write, she said, I'll start with one of my earliest memories, and then nothing. Lottie's mind was blank. Mr. Cook, his eyes on the glow-in-the-dark constellations on Lottie's ceiling, hadn't realized what was wrong. Go on, Lottie. Tell a nice, quiet one. A moment slipped by, and then another, and Lottie sobbed. Lottie almost never cried, sobbed so loudly that her father fell clean off her loft bed and nearly broke his ankle when he tried to land on his feet. Lottie's sobbing shook the rickety bed, and she buried her face in the pillows. I can't, she cried. I've forgotten. Mr. Cook felt like crying himself on account of his ankle. He hobbled around under the loft and tried to walk off the paint. Lottie, don't cry now. You'll remember. You will. All I know is the capital of Ecuador in the year of the Treaty of Paris was signed. All I know is the square root of 144. Down below the loft bed, where Lottie couldn't see him, Mr. Cook allowed himself a deep, satisfied smile. Don't worry, he muttered as he hobbled off the room and over the house looking and searching. It was a difficult house to search, and Lottie's sobs echoed and crooked off the walls for nearly half an hour. The house had once been just 2 square rooms more than 100 years ago. Since then, it had been added to and expanded in a haphazard sort of way. By the time Lottie was grown, there were more than a dozen crooked rooms, depending on how you counted them. Once, for instance, when Lottie was 2 and the autumn leaves were especially brilliant, she and her father had slapped a tiny room onto the back of the house to accommodate the 1,000 or so leaves that she collected and soaked in glycerin. That night, while Lottie cried and cried, Mr. Cook searched all the strange rooms that they had built. The leaf room with its floor of soft leaf mulch, the mud room out back with the dirt floor and waterproof walls, the spinning room, and the miniature room, the giant room, which were nearly magical. Finally, Mr. Cook found what he had been looking for. In the giant room, beneath the enormous footstool, he found 3 rain boots, his missing truck keys, a massive flashlight, and the story box. Its rich cherry color was still gleaming. He carried it back to Lottie's room without looking inside. He managed to get himself off the wobbly ladder with his now swollen ankle and pushed the shining box toward the shuddering bundle of polar trick pajamas that was Lottie. This should help. Lottie looked up. The sight of the box made her gasp. A moment went by, then another. She looked at her father's round, hopeful eyes. She had never felt worse. Not only had she forgotten every single story that she had ever wanted to treasure, but now she had to break his heart. She opened the box and showed him. When the lid came off, the whole room shimmered slightly, but the box was empty. His expression didn't change. He was waiting. Lottie nudged the empty box toward him and sniffed out the words. I didn't use it. Not a single thing in there. It's too late. You were right all along. I don't remember anything important anymore. And now I'll fail 6th grade because I have nothing to write. I'm not going back. But Mr. Cook was still smiling at her, looking a little too pleased with himself in Lottie's opinion. Didn't he understand what she was telling him? Try it, was all he said. He hobbled back to the ladder, and with one last smile over his shoulder, he limped out of the room. Lottie collapsed on the bed. By now, she had no tears left. The room was dark, but it was definitely a warm cherry glow coming from inside the empty box. Lottie tried to ignore it and just fall into a miserable sleep, but she found that she couldn't sleep. Her eyes kept opening and drifting back to the box. Finally, she pushed the lid back into place to block the glow, but it still seemed to be seeping from under the edges. Lottie wasn't sure how much time had passed, alone in a dark room, aching for sleep to come, but it was very hard to keep track of time. But she was quite certain that in the middle of the night, when she heard something, a quiet rustling sound, that it was definitely coming from inside of the box. Lottie sat up in her bed, her heart suddenly racing. With her rational side, she tried to calm herself down. You must have trapped a moth in there, she told herself. A big, giant gypsy moth. She persisted as the rustling grew stronger. Take off the lid. Shoo it out, she thought. Don't be silly. She reached out her hand and touched the lid. It wasn't quite the same static electricity, but Lottie would later say that it felt almost like touching a doorknob on a cold winter morning and feeling the sparks rush into your hand. She lifted the lid and a big fistful of something, a flurry of color, came swirling straight at her face. Lottie tried screaming, but couldn't. She cringed back and missed her by inches, veering off towards the left toward the open window. It smashed full of force into the screen and rebounded towards her dresser, where it made a sort of landing. Now, as it noticed its own reflection in the dresser mirror, Lottie was able to get a good look at it. It reminded her of a bird about the size of a crow with the deep black eyes on either side of a beak. It stretched its wings and walked around the dresser, poking at various things. Yes, it was definitely a bird with scratching 3-toed feet. The problem was its colors. This thing was every possible color. Nothing like a rainbow, more like the way a box of crayons looks after you dumped all the crayons out, broken a few times, and peeled off most of the wrappers. The bird noticed something in the mirror and looked back over its shoulder at Lottie's bulletin board. It squawked in a pleased way and hurled itself across the room, just barely missing the overhead light. Pecking at the many layers of artwork dating back to a 2-year-old's scribbles at the very bottom, the bird seemed satisfied. Then it turned to Lottie. "There you are," it said. It's very clearly speaking. It spoke much better than it flew, and it took Lottie a second to be surprised that it could talk. Hello, bird, she stammered, and then trying to be friendly, she sort of whistled, the way people do when they want the attention of a trained parrot. The bird laughed and whistled back. Lottie stared. She whistled again feebly. The bird barreled over to the lid of the cherry box, its eye at her. "Squawk! I've waited years, and you're going to whistle at me, Lottie Cook." Lottie was speechless. "Oh, bygones," it squawked. "No time now." The bird took Lottie's little finger in its tickly claw and urged her closer to the box. At this point, it really didn't occur to Lottie to resist. She felt herself floating along after the bird as if in a dream. In some way, she thought she actually was dreaming, but she was not. "Watch your big pointy head," it chirped, delighted to see that Lottie was cooperating. And there they went, into the box. Lottie had the lovely slow-motion feeling of falling into a dream. The suspense went on, and she wondered why she didn't jerk herself awake like usual. The longer they traveled, the more she sensed that they were going down exactly. The bird's little claws gripped Lottie's finger tightly, and she felt its wings twitching in 100 different directions. Flying clearly wasn't its specialty, but it didn't seem to make a difference now. However the bird flapped and fluttered, the only direction it seemed to take was through the dark, warm swirls of cherry wood, then through the changing clouds and skies, then through the leaves, blossoms, branches, until they landed at the bottom of a young tree bloom. Lottie lay in the clover and looked up. She knew exactly where she was. One deep breath, and she could smell the cherry blossoms of her favorite tree, the one her father had definitely cut down. But there it was, and as the breeze waved the branches, she could hear the sound of her mother's song, the thought she had forgotten. She remembered it all now, because there it was. The tree had grown from a seed her mother had spit from the kitchen window before Lottie was born. "It's the best dream I've ever had," Lottie thought. Standing up at her tree, she smiled. She knew she would never forget this story again as long as she lived. She didn't want to move because she was afraid of waking up. "Squawk!" interrupted the bird from one of the lower branches just inches from Lottie's ear. "What time is it? Can't be too careful." The bird squinted at the sun, which was still above the western cornfields beyond them. "I'd say 5 o'clock. If it's summer, hard to say. Definitely afternoon or later. Squawk! Could you tell me time, Lottie Cook?" Lottie felt like she was moving in slow motion as she sat up and looked at the strange creature in the eye. "Why are you in my dreams?" she whispered, still not wanting to wake up. The bird's neck feathers were all puffed up. It blinked at Lottie and then whistled in a plain, ordinary parrot sort of way, twice. Lottie hesitated and then slowly stretched out her hand. "Who are you?" The bird flopped onto Lottie's palm, laughing. "I'm Umber. Thought you'd know. I'm not a dream." "You're not?" "Cherry treat, squawk. Not just a tree, other things to do." Lottie squinted at the strange creature. "Your name is Umber?" "Actually, no, much longer. Burnt umber, blue, green, white, periwinkle, sienna, turquoise, rose, yellow, evergreen, black, white, silver, midnight." Umber rattled on. Lottie felt her earliest memories rushing back into her mind as she listened to the bird. The sun slipped behind the corn silos in the western hills, and Umber shuddered. "What time do you think it is?" "We need a place to hide before dark." And that is where we will stop for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I will see you later.